Hello everybody, I'm Kaboda. In this video we're going to discuss another argument pushed by Russian propaganda and those who have fallen prey to it. The argument that we often hear to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that NATO is responsible for the war, or that NATO's actions justified Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. We're going to examine whether or not this is a realistic claim and whether it truly justifies the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To start off, three main arguments used to either blame NATO for the war or justify Russia's actions must be known. A. The argument that NATO agreed to not expand any further during the collapse of the USSR. B. That NATO expansion posed a risk to Russia, forcing them to respond. And C. That Russia needed to stop NATO expansion. We are going to cover each one of these points and conclude whether or not they are legitimate or not. First, it is necessary to establish some context for how NATO came to be, and what it is today, starting off with the founding of NATO. This is important as a level of understanding of NATO is necessary to progress forwards. Following the Second World War, the East and West would come to a head, with the Soviets refusing to pull out of a number of countries it pushed through as it battled Germany. In the Middle East, Churchill would make his famous Iron Curtain speech, criticising the Soviet methods in which Stalin would respond by comparing Churchill to Hitler, a trend of pinning enemies of the state as fascists that lasted in Russian culture to this day. Following this, the Cold War would kick off with the Berlin blockade on the 24th of June 1948. Berlin was partially controlled by Western countries following the end of the Second World War. However, Berlin was deep into the Soviet-controlled East Germany. The Soviets restricted land access to Berlin for the Western nations, resulting in the effective Berlin airlift. The blockade lasted until the 12th of May 1949, 323 days, with deep damage done to East and West relations. On the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation would be established following the signing of the treaty by 12 nations. These nations were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These nations would become the founding members of what would be one of the most powerful alliances to ever exist. One of the most potent aspects of NATO that made it so successful was that of Article 5. Article 5 commits each member state to consider an armed attack against a single member state in the areas defined by Article 6 to be an armed attack against them all. This power means that the smallest nation is seen as no different from the strongest. Every nation in NATO then falls under a defensive umbrella in which all will be defended by the rest of NATO when attacked. This became a very effective deterrent, while providing peace of mind to smaller nations in the West. The only time Article 5 would ever be used was following the 9/11 attacks on the United States. During the Cold War, as tensions grew even higher between East and West, with both in the belief that a war was imminent between the two Goliath superpowers, West Germany would join NATO. And within a week, the Soviets would counter NATO with their own version, coined as the Warsaw Pact, consisting of many of its puppet states it captured during the Second World War. The Warsaw Pact in this time was an impressive force, and at some points was considered a stronger military force than NATO, with its strong industrial capabilities at the time. The two blocs would remain great rivals until the Warsaw Pact was dissolved on the 25th of February 1991, to be followed by the collapse of the USSR in December of that very same year. During the Cold War, NATO would grow from 12 to 16 nations by the time the Berlin Wall would fall. In the lead up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and as the USSR collapsed, many of the nations that had been puppet states under the Russia-led bloc would seek security against any future attempt at this happening again. There are 9 nations that were a part of the Warsaw Pact that chose to join the NATO bloc. These are Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Many of these nations have a history of control under Russia, even prior to the Soviet Union, and include a number of repressed uprisings that were crushed by the Soviet authorities at the time. To this day, there is still a large lack of trust of Russia in Eastern Europe, and have been the largest contributors to helping Ukraine as a proportion of their GDP and size. Whilst many push this NATO expansion, it is therefore important to note that each nation that makes up the bloc does so on their own accord, and can equally leave just as they join, demonstrated by France in 1966. though they would rejoin later. This, compared to the Soviet treatment of Eastern Europe, is why so many of these nations decided to join the bloc, with its strongest rules being in regards to what civil rights are applied within a member state, what spending the military is receiving, and what the state of democracy within that nation is. And there are a plethora of examples that show weak enforcement of this. Instead, it's more likely that the strongest nations that make up the NATO bloc will decide to pull some military support for these regions. Due to this, it's understandable why nations that have been puppet states for decades may view the bloc to be such an attractive option, with its security guarantees and relaxed rule structure. However, the move of these countries to seek security under NATO to protect their national security integrity would not go unnoticed. This is often a sore subject for Russia, which takes us on to the argument that NATO promised not to expand eastwards following the collapse of the USSR. While this claim is often repeated by the Russian government, there is no written agreement to back this claim up, leading to a he said she said scenario where Russia claims there was a verbal agreement on the matter, which would be unlikely that such an important aspect of Russia's security would be left to a closed doors verbal agreement. Further addressing the lack of evidence, it would be unfair to make the claim that the Soviet leadership believed the words of a diplomat from a nation they had been feuding with for the better part of a century, when taking into consideration security concerns. Gorbachev himself, who was the president of the Soviet Union at the time, will go on to say the following in regards to this claimed agreement. The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised the issue, not even after the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist in 1991. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. Gorbachev is the best authority for this aside from NATO, who also claims that this agreement never happened. Gorbachev would have been the very person who this agreement was promised to, so it makes little sense for this agreement to be believed when both the Soviet president and NATO agreed that it never happened. With these considerations, it seems highly unlikely that such a verbal agreement ever even took place, and cannot be logically used to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia may have security concerns, but so do the nations that were previously controlled by Russia. Unfortunately for Putin, Russia does not hold a monopoly on having national security, and NATO provides such security for a number of Eastern European nations. The claimed agreement with NATO lacks so much evidence that it cannot possibly be used to pin NATO as some sort of evil force for going back on a promise when such a promise is not proven to even exist. Due to this, the agreement cannot be used to justify the invasion of Ukraine, or be used to paint NATO as causing the war by breaking a verbal agreement that likely never existed, by the leaders that have been out of power for decades. This refutes the first argument. Moving on from the issue of the agreement, it's worth assessing what countries actually joined NATO after the collapse, after examining their respective reasons for joining, especially the nations that border Russia, which encapsulates the point that NATO expansion is justification for the war. Starting off from the northernmost point of NATO, Russia's border with Norway. Norway was a founding member of NATO in 1949 and was the first NATO nation to directly border Russia. The border is incredibly small and only spans 121 miles or 195 kilometres. The border region is also sparsely populated and has been home to a few conflicts between Russia and Finland, the previous occasion being between the USSR and German-controlled Norway. Norway gained independence in 1905 and has a tame history of Russia compared to the rest of the NATO nations that borders Russia, such as that of Estonia. Estonia borders Russia in the Baltic region and was under the control of Russia for nearly 300 years, with large growth in the Estonian identity in the 1850s, and eventually gained its independence through war with the Soviets in 1920. This independence would unfortunately be short-lived, as following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, Estonia was assigned to the Soviet Union. The Estonian government felt it had no choice but to comply, and Estonia was annexed into the Soviet Union on the 6th of August 1940. Estonia would gain its independence once more on the 20th of August 1991 during the Moscow coup, and would join NATO as well as the European Union in 2004. Estonian polling shows 68% of Estonians perceive Russia as a threat to Estonia following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Estonia has a population of only 1.3 million people, with a military consisting of only around 20,000 people with no nuclear weapons stationed in the nation, and only around 1,000 NATO troops in the country, not likely enough to launch a ground invasion into the Russian Federation. Further south along the NATO-Russian border from Estonia is Latvia. Latvia, like Estonia, was also annexed by the Soviet Union. Latvian identity and language grew strongly around the 1600s, with a Latvian common language being assembled. Latvia would have a history of being on the front of tensions between a number of European powers for centuries. Like Estonia, it was not until the First World War that Latvia would gain its independence, as the Russian Revolution threw Russia into chaos, leaving room for the region to secure its sovereignty. Unfortunately for Latvia, it too was annexed by the Soviet Union following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with its independence being lost until the 4th of May 1990. Latvia's population numbers at 1.8 million, with an armed forces personnel size of 16,700 active duty forces. Latvia, like Estonia, is reliant upon NATO for its security from its large neighbour, and the number of NATO troops in the country is only 1,800. Moving south again, we shift away from the border of Russia to that of the Kaliningrad Oblast, which is bordered by the NATO member Lithuania. Lithuania has a similar history in the recent century to that of Estonia and Latvia, with its independence being gained during the collapse of the USSR. Lithuania as a state first existed nearly 1,000 years ago in 1251, and was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was at one point one of the great powers of Europe. Following the invasion of Ukraine, 90% of Lithuanians have an unfavourable opinion of Russia, with half of the population viewing Russia as the greatest current threat to Lithuania. The country has a population of 2.8 million, the largest out of the Baltic nations, as well as holding the largest military with 23,000 active personnel and a total reserve of just over 100,000. This is largely due to the Suwalki Gap, which is a pressure point between NATO and Russia during a conflict scenario, as Belarus, controlled by pro-Russian self-confessed dictator Alexander Lukashenko, with Russian military bases en masse within the country, and Kaliningrad, one of the most militarised places on Earth, separated by a 60 to 100 kilometre strip of land that, if taken by Russian forces, will completely cut off the Baltic states from NATO. With this considered, the forces Lithuania maintains, combined with that of the other Baltic nations, would not be enough to invade the Russian Federation, and pose little more than a deterrence from a Russian attack in-country through the Suwalki corridor. Last on the list is Poland. Poland, like the Baltic states, has a history of rule by the USSR, and gained its freedom once more upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Poland has a strong perception of Russia as a threat, with 94% voting that they see Russia as a major threat to Poland. Due to the country bordering Kaliningrad and its much larger size than the Baltics, Poland's military numbers at 150,000 active personnel. However, Poland intends to roughly double the size of the armed forces to 300,000, and to spend at least 3% of its GDP on the defence budget in 2023. This leads them to be far stronger than the Baltic nations. However, while technically bordering Russia due to Kaliningrad, it is the furthest mentioned nation from the Russian mainland, entirely cut off by Belarus, with a distance of around 250 miles or 370 kilometres between the two countries at their closest point. When all nations bordering Russia within NATO are added together, they still represent a force of around 500,000 troops, which is still smaller than the Russian army. It is also worth noting that none of these nations contain nuclear weapons, and stand little chance of ever attacking the Russian mainland. This brings us on to our next chapter, where we must assess how NATO has truly expanded from the collapse of the USSR until today, with the admission of these aforementioned countries and what that means for Russia's security as well as the nation's Russia borders. With all the threat about NATO expansion towards Russia's border, it's important to assess what this actually means and why it is such an issue for Russia. NATO's expansion brought no great army stood at Russia's doorstep, and there has been no scenario where a land invasion of Russia has been plausible, possible, or planned by NATO. Following the final expansion to Russia's border in 2004, NATO expanded no closer to Russia, with the same border situation to this very day, 19 years later. There is likelihood that Finland and Sweden will join NATO. However, this is irrelevant due to the fact that Russia's invasion took place prior to their pledge to join the alliance, and thus cannot be considered when discussing NATO expansion in regards to justification for Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. After the current border situation was established, with no expansion in 18 years at the time of the invasion, it becomes necessary instead to understand what NATO expansion truly meant for Russia outside of its paranoia of a NATO attack, which we will cover later in the video. NATO's expansion secures the defence of smaller nations of which have had their sovereignty brought into question by the Russian government multiple times, with a clear disregard for the security and free will of nations that border Russia. It shows ignorance to why these nations join NATO, and instead draws implications of a NATO attack on the Russian Federation. The reason for this is that NATO's expansion has no negative impact on Russia's economy, with their GDP almost doubling from 591 billion in 2004 to 989 billion in 2006. Following this, the cultural impact on Russia by NATO is minimal, with nationalism gaining traction under Putin's rule and Russian identity becoming cemented following the collapse of the USSR. This considered, it shows little negative impact brought upon Russia by NATO's expansion, with no damage to Russia culturally or economically, and no NATO troop massing on the Russian border or indication of such a fanciful invasion. The reason for Putin's dismay of the alliance comes down to one thing NATO does damage, and that's Russia's ability to annex and control lands outside of its border. While we will address the security threat NATO poses, it's important to display that that is the only issue that NATO brings to Russia. With no war erupting between Russia and NATO, and Russia not invading any of its neighbours, the alliance poses no threat to Russia's existence. With its willingness to be deeply involved with Russia in trade, with the gas problem in Europe showing an openness to rely on Russia for deeply important resources, sending the opposite message than that of an alliance preparing for war. While the alliance is often coined as an anti-Russian organisation, that is down to Russia being feared by nations that it once controlled, and being an organisation that restricts Russia's ability to control them. This shows that in a way NATO is of course anti-Russia, but anti-Russian ability to bully smaller nations. If Russia's plans are to expand and occupy neighbouring nations and bring back a Russian empire, then NATO indeed poses a threat to Russia's capability of achieving that very goal, but only if that is the case. As if Russia instead wishes to trade, NATO is willing to work with Russia, and has shown this. NATO does not force nations to join through war, and has no ability to force its member states to attack Russia without an initial attack from them first. Russia is a capitalist state, much like all of NATO. The disparity between Russia and NATO is not like that of them and the Soviet Union, with such an ideological difference. Instead, NATO is a preventative measure to stop wars of expansion in Europe continuing, with the current example of this taking place in a non-NATO member state at the hands of Russia. With all this considered, it makes no sense to claim that NATO poses a genuine existential threat to a peaceful Russia that is not waging war. It poses no threat to Russia as a nation that focuses on the standard of living and domestic problems, and instead to imperialistic politicians with delusions of revitalising an empire like the centuries of old. Following the scenario for a NATO conflict with Russia being highly unlikely without Russia acting aggressively, it is therefore time to move on to the security question for Russia, with this remaining the only outlining issue being the risk of a NATO attack into Russia. Russia's paranoia regarding the possibility of a NATO attack must be discussed, for it's the entire premise of the NATO expansion issue, that it puts NATO in a more advantageous position for this war of which the current Russian government believes to be seemingly inevitable. We've discussed how this would only be caused by Russian aggression, so it's time to consider the alternative and why it is highly improbable. NATO, for one, was postured in a very unoffensive manner, with a force on the Russian border consistent of only 4,500, outside of the host nation's militaries which are vastly smaller than Russia's. It's illogical to come to the conclusion that NATO was planning an attack with its current force being so small, and it only increased this number to 40,000 following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, again showing NATO's nature of responding to Russian aggression and not being the initiator of it. NATO forces, even post-invasion, number a quarter of the force Russia allocated to invade Ukraine, displaying the inadequate offensive capabilities of this force build-up, and the little threat it truly poses to Russia in an attack scenario. While we have addressed the how, it's also worth addressing the why. Why would NATO attack Russia is a necessary question in understanding the level of paranoia that guides Russian foreign policy. Pre-invasion, NATO's trade with Russia was highly beneficial to both sides, and an attack on the Russian mainland would have deep economic ramifications, following the effects of sanctions on Russia would in turn have on Europe being so played up by Moscow. This makes the argument that if Europe was so economically vested in Russia, that an attack on Russia was even less likely, with such deep trade connection posing such a threat to both sides if it was disturbed. What NATO would stand to gain from an attack on Russia becomes even more ridiculous when we take into account the fact that Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, and has made clear that an attack on its soil would result in nuclear conflict. This means that NATO attacking the Russian mainland would result in a damaging economic crash and a nuclear holocaust that could eliminate entire regions of the alliance. With such an outcome being so damaging, there is nothing to gain from attacking Russia that can offset such a colossal risk. With this clear, it becomes almost impossible to expect NATO would truly attack Russia, with the certain destruction that it would bring them. Another relevant point often made is that NATO being closer to Russia would give it more time than Russia in a nuclear war. However, with the existence of nuclear submarines that can already manoeuvre closely to Russian nuclear sites, and the huge risk that if Russia was to manage to retaliate, it would be, again, nuclear holocaust, destroying the NATO bloc almost entirely, if not absolutely. With this made clear, it is illogical to come to the conclusion that NATO would initiate an attack on Russia that would risk nuclear holocaust without Russia attacking NATO first, which is equally unlikely due to the alliance's equal nuclear power, displaying why nations gain such a strong security benefit from joining the alliance, and this is why it has little true effect on Russia's security due to its nuclear deterrent. While internal questions on NATO's ability to be involved in Russian domestic politics could be questioned, this would not be made much more possible with NATO expansion, and could take place with or without Ukraine joining NATO. In conclusion, NATO expansion does not truly pose nearly as much of a risk to Russia's security as is often portrayed due to Russia's nuclear deterrence, and NATO's weak posture on the Russian border, and then becomes clear the alliance only limits Russia's ability to do what it is doing in Ukraine, taking and annexing land, expanding through war. With Ukraine being brought up, and Russia using the risk of Ukraine joining NATO, it's now time to assess whether or not this was actually going to happen. Following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, Russia annexed Crimea. This would be Putin's key to keeping Ukraine out of NATO. The reason for this is that any nation to be accepted into the bloc must not have any border disputes. This is due to the fact that any nation could join the alliance and then immediately utilise Article 5 to fix its land disputes, claiming that its territorial integrity is under attack. This was the case with Crimea, as the Ukrainian government refused to agree with Russia's claim, and the same with the separatist region of Donbass. If Ukraine was a state with a puppet government holding the sole purpose to join NATO, they would have happily ceded this land to join NATO. Instead, they refused to let Russia take these lands. The issue of time is also relevant to Russia's claim that Ukraine would join NATO, as Ukraine did not achieve this in 8 years, and it seems highly unlikely that Russia would wait 8 years if it was such an important issue, and especially wait until Ukraine was more capable of defending itself from Russia, as in 2014 Russia would have not had as much ability to be sure that Ukraine would not join NATO as it does now, and in 2014 the Ukrainian military was a shell of its impressive force it now has on display, going head-on with the Russian military. 8 years showed the world a Ukraine with a war in the east slowing down, and an inability to join NATO consistently due to Crimea, and it therefore becomes illogical to come to the conclusion that Russia waited so long to find such immediate fault with Ukraine joining NATO, even though that 8 years showed such a fault never coming to fruition. Ukraine is not even the only country to be in this scenario, nor the first, as Georgia experienced a similar problem following the 2008 invasion of Georgia at the hands of the Russian Federation, and despite Georgia intending to join NATO ever since, it has not done so in over a decade due to the border dispute the invasion caused, following the separatist regions of Georgia becoming still viewed by the government as Georgian territory, again causing a territorial dispute. This shows that there was clear evidence to the Russian government that Ukraine was unable to join NATO so long as it had a border dispute, which did not change by the time Russia committed its forces to invade Ukraine, again making this claim largely illogical. Not only this, but this shows that NATO expansion was essentially not taking place, with no growth towards Russia since 2004, and Ukraine being unable to join NATO. There was no immediate issue of NATO expansion that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would solve, debunking this claim that NATO was immediately expanding towards Russia as is often claimed. Finally, with the likelihood of NATO expansion being addressed as deeply unlikely a scenario, and the actual expansion that took place towards Russia not taken place since 2004, it's time to discuss the expansion itself. Russia justifies its actions of war and aggression through protecting its own security, with the implication that it is fair to act if it is in the name of security. However, when nations around Russia act in their best interests of security by joining NATO and not causing any war, death or destruction in the process, it is painted as some great unacceptable evil, which is deeply contrasting to how Russia expects to be treated when it invades sovereign nations, fuels war, and annexes land. Russia's security concerns only outweigh the security concerns for other nations for them, and in the international world their security is no more important than that of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. Ukraine's wish to join NATO occurred after Russia forcefully annexed Ukraine's sovereign territory, and the necessity felt in Ukraine to join the alliance was therefore created by Russia itself. This is comparable to the invasion of Ukraine causing Finland and Sweden to join NATO, as nations see Russian aggression as validating the existence of NATO. With Russia's actions in Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova, it is difficult to discredit the wish for nations that border Russia to join NATO. Russia does not get a free moral pass for invading sovereign nations and starting wars that kills hundreds of thousands of people. The world does not bow to Russia's wishes, and it cannot be expected of nations that fear Russian aggression to put their own security behind that of Russia, and for NATO to allow these nations security when they fear it to be some form of evil. NATO provides security for nations that join it, and with the notion of NATO attacking Russia being debunked, it's difficult to see why NATO should not allow these nations such sanctuary. The actions of Russia in Ukraine are their own, and while the fear of NATO expansion, despite its unlikeliness, is claimed by Russia, this does not make it NATO's decision to invade Ukraine, and the blame for the war lies solely at the feet of he who started it, Putin. NATO expansion did not cause the war, Russia did. Russia saw Ukraine being unable to join NATO for 8 years, with no expansion towards their borders for nearly 2 decades, and somehow we are expected to believe that NATO is the one to blame for the war, and not Russia for deciding to invade Ukraine, which it absolutely did not have to do. While NATO's actions play a part of Putin's decision, that does not take away from the fact that it was his decision to initiate the invasion, and his alone. NATO could at most be given some responsibility for having influence in Russia's decision, but that is nothing compared to the decision to actively and immediately invade Ukraine, which was entirely avoidable and unnecessary. Thus, it is time to move on to the closing arguments and finally debunk this claim that NATO expansion is to blame for the war and not Russia itself. Finally, the initial arguments from earlier can be concluded upon. A. The argument that NATO agreed to not expand any further during the collapse of the USSR. NATO did not in fact agree to avoid expanding, and no evidence exists to back this claim up. NATO has always claimed an open door policy as long as all member states accept and apply a member into the bloc. This argument is therefore false. B. That NATO expansion posed a risk to Russia, forcing them to respond. NATO expansion did not pose a direct risk to Russia, with Russia's nuclear deterrent, NATO's small forces along the border, and NATO's inability to assure all states in the alliance would commit to an attack, and the failure of NATO's expansion to have any negative effect on Russia outside of this paranoia of a mythical NATO invasion. This argument is therefore false. And finally, C. That Russia needed to stop NATO expansion. NATO had in fact not been expanding towards Russia since 2004, 18 years prior to the invasion of Ukraine. A NATO expansion into Ukraine was made incompatible with Ukraine's territorial disputes, of which Zelensky, the president of Ukraine at the time of the invasion, had refused to cede these territories, further delaying any ability for Ukraine to join the bloc. NATO expansion is thus not justification for the invasion of Ukraine, and in no way takes away from the responsibility of the Russian government initiating this large-scale war, leaving all the blame entirely on them, and their false pretext of NATO expansion being a debunked fallacy for them to hide their true imperialistic ambitions and warmongering actions behind. Now, next time you see someone claiming that NATO expansion is to blame for the Russian invasion, or that it justifies it, feel free to send them this video which debunks this preposterous claim parroted by Russian propaganda. I'm Kaboda, and together we can fight Russian propaganda one video at a time. Thanks for watching guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.